The purpose of this roundtable was to discuss the experience of renegotiations in transport projects, and particularly road projects, drawing heavily on the experience of the United States and Latin America. The objective of this being to develop a series of policy recommendations and conclusions which were aimed at improving the outcomes of contract renegotiations in future. We addressed two specific challenges. Firstly, whether it was possible to manage PPP contracts and their renegotiation in such a way as to deliver favourable outcomes for the public sector, and if not, whether or not we should consider the viability of PPP as a delivery model for infrastructure as compared to other potential delivery models. We found it important to place contract renegotiation in its right context. In other words, that it is some way down the food chain. In other words, it's very difficult to envisage effective contract renegotiation if there hasn't been a proper project selection process, taking account of the economic benefits of those projects and their priority, the conduct of a well-regulated contract award procedure, which may involve dialogue or negotiation, but which is based on well-regulated award criteria and open, transparent and competitive bidding, and the principle of equality of treatment. Following from that, contract renegotiation takes place in the context of the overall arrangements for the management of a contract, including the way in which the performance of the economic operator is verified, and if substandard, appropriate penalties are enforced. So it's very difficult to envisage effective contract renegotiation, we concluded, without these three preconditions. We discussed and debated what constituted renegotiation, and we concluded that change in risk matrix and probably via the contract conditions represented renegotiation, or change in the project scope, whereas foreseen changes in specific predefined circumstances, such as tariff changes or indexation of payments made by the government sector, probably didn't constitute renegotiation for the useful purpose of this discussion. We concluded that there were three fundamental propositions underlying the conduct of PPP and therefore their renegotiation. Firstly, that the idea of PPP was to secure value for money for the public sector, but still allowing the private sector to make a profit commensurate with the risk that it is taken. Secondly, that there is no inconsistency with a well-regulated award procedure with clearly defined award criteria and clearly weighted award criteria, and the effectiveness of contract management. In other words, a public sector body needs to both award the contract in an effective manner, but also monitor performance in an effective manner. There is no tension between the two. When we started to draw conclusions, we recognised with due modesty that not all conclusions will be valid in all circumstances. And that is important when we come to consider some of the recommendations later. We defined some of the key issues arising when contracts are renegotiated, the fundamental weakness of the public sector post-award once it is, as it happens in many cases, given a monopoly for the market, often for quite a long period of time, to a single economic operator. Secondly, the incentives for the economic operator in some circumstances where the signals aren't correctly sent in the contract award procedure to bid low and expect to increase its profitability through renegotiation. And thirdly, in some circumstances, the incentive of the public sector to collude with that. Firstly, because it allows for the circumvention of public spending limits, and secondly, because it may allow for concessionaires to have monopoly rents which may be recycled into the funds of the political parties who awarded the contract. We asked fundamental questions like why renegotiations are occurring. We did indeed look at the proximity of elections as a potential factor. We looked at whether or not democracies were more prone to renegotiation and were more successful than were authoritarian regimes. More fundamentally, we looked at whether or not it was a viable alternative simply not to renegotiate and to allow the economic operator in some circumstances to make losses or to go bankrupt. And we recognised that that was explicitly linked to the termination liabilities within the contract. In other words, the amount of the outstanding debt which needed to be paid to the lenders, even if the project failed as a result of the non-performance of the economic operator. When we started to consider some of the potential remedies, they broadly fell into a number of categories. Firstly, there were a number of remedies associated with transparency, i.e. the idea that greater transparency would make it more likely that value for money would be secured in renegotiations. Secondly, there were a group of recommendations around independent decision making in contract renegotiation. Should these be submitted to an independent expert panel? Should they be submitted to an independent regulator? Should they be subject to ex ante approval or merely advice by both of these bodies? Should transparency consist of publishing the details of contract renegotiation in a public forum, such as in the EU contract modification notices in the European Journal? What was the role of auditors in ex post verification of contract renegotiation? Thirdly, we looked at a number of specific legal measures, the idea of a period of freeze on contract renegotiations, which on which opinion was divided. Should there be an absolute ban on renegotiations contractually expressed, or should there be a set of specific ex ante conditions when renegotiation is legally possible? But in the end, we reached the conclusion that the most important aspect of managing renegotiation was that, firstly, that they are intended to be exceptional, and secondly, that they need to be conducted by a well-resourced, competent public authority with the will to enforce the terms of the contract, which has sent signals in that direction in the way the projects are selected and awarded and are managed before any kind of renegotiation is considered. One final point. The renegotiation of contracts is often considered in the context of incomplete contract theory. And one of the most interesting pieces of evidence that came out of this event was the frequency and nature of renegotiations during the construction phase. In other words, long before the operational phase has even started, and that called into some question the the extent to which incomplete contract theory can be considered a satisfactory explanation.